ahead and get started now. I have to say, let me own up to this. I'm not super familiar with WebEx. I don't use it as often as I use Zoom. So I'm going to stop periodically and ask if you guys have questions, but I generally am a pretty open, casual, off-the-cuff person. So if at any point you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, just unmute yourself and interrupt me. I don't know if I can't see the chat at the moment, but I'm assuming I'd get a notification if somebody put something in the chat. So we will troubleshoot as we go in terms of you guys asking questions, but I will periodically leave space. So welcome everybody to, oh, Mal,
I was just gonna say, no, I was just gonna say, if people put it in the chat and you can't see it, I can always unmute and let you know.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Mallory. Mallory's our fearless leader, everyone. She's often behind the scenes, but she deserves to be front and center because she coordinates so much of this and is big support for all of us group fitness teachers. So thanks, Mel. So welcome. This is the second version of this talk today. The Lerner Learning series has been kicking off quite well this semester. We've got a huge variety of topics, and I am back to talk again about posture, alignment, and movement. My name is Meredith, and as I said, I'm a group fitness teacher, but we'll get in a little bit about me in just a moment. So what are we up to today? We will do a brief introduction of who I am. Then we're going to kind of dive in on like, why do we even care about posture? Why does it matter? Especially if you're thinking more about like your fitness life, like who really cares if I'm standing up straight in my everyday life? We'll talk about that and why you should care. Next, we'll get into some key concepts that have to do with posture and alignment, and then some tools on kind of honing your optimal posture. We'll talk a little bit about fascia, which I'm not even going to talk about now. We'll just get to it later. And then we will talk about posture and movement, and we'll start to apply some of these ideas and techniques that have to do with posture to some photos, but also to ourselves. At the end, I'm going to recap some of the exercises I've given you throughout the class, and then also touch on one new one, I believe. So, oh wait, I want to go back. So this picture of the plant with the root system probably seems strange because this is about the body, but we can really think of, as I said, posture is kind of this foundational, it's the roots under the ground that keep us stable in movement and kind of primed to grow strong, tall, long, you know, all the good things, feel really integrated in our bodies. And that posture is kind of the seed of all of that. So who am I? I am a second year MPH student at the Milken School of Public Health at GW. My track is global environmental health. So if you ever want to chat about that, you'll get my contact info at the end. I also have my 200-hour yoga teacher training certification in a style of yoga called LIT. And I'll get into that in a bit. And I teach this on this semester, Tuesdays and Thursdays, through the virtual Lerner classes, and both my classes are at 4:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So what is LIT yoga? LIT yoga was developed by a physical therapist. Her name is Laura Hyman. She has a large online presence as well as a daily platform. So if at the end of the talk you want to know more about that, I'm happy to share those details. So Laura is, you know, originated as a physical therapist, and her specialty was in neurodevelopment. So simultaneously, she started teaching yoga in a traditional vinyasa style, and she was looking at the people she worked with in her PT practice, and then the people she worked with in her yoga classes, and started to notice that the rate of growth and the trajectory of growth was very different for the two groups. She found that patients she saw in physical therapy were progressing much faster than the students she saw in yoga. And the irony there is that often, you know, the people going to her yoga classes were able-bodied, they weren't dealing with a specific injury, or Laura worked with a lot of stroke patients. So you would think this group that had seemingly fewer barriers to movement and to optimal movement would just kind of skyrocket. But that wasn't the case. And so she started taking the principles of physical therapy and meshing them with her yoga practice and her teaching. And thus was born Lit Yoga. So it's a really functional, biomechanically oriented yoga style. This whole thing will not be about yoga for you people that are not yogis. No worries. So, as I said, who cares? Why do we care about posture? Why are we talking about it in the context of movement? I want to introduce this idea of the starting line concept. So imagine you are, let's say, at a field day or something. Everybody is lined up at the same line, and you're trying to get to, I don't know, let's say it's a 50-yard dash. So everybody's starting at the same place, you're on even footing, and best man wins, right? We can think about this starting line, this place that we all start, as our optimal posture. So when we all are kind of stacking our bodies in optimal ways, we start right at the starting line. When we start to deviate from our optimal posture, meaning, we are slumping or your pelvis is out of alignment, something is off, we start to get moved back from the starting line, which means before we can even start our 50-yard dash, we have to make up the difference of our starting point to the starting line. So it's like bumping you back 20 feet in your race when you could be starting 20 feet forward and just moving forward from there. So we like to talk in Lit about this idea of posture as this foundational setup for an optimal movement practice, meaning when we start with good posture, we can kind of guarantee that we will be progressing forward. Whereas when we have more deviant posture, there's a lot of ground to make up before we can then make gains or progress or increase range of motion. Movement is this practice of taking energy from the ground and transferring it through our body. So if you think about running, we push off the ground, rolling through our feet, and then we have to harness that push all the way up through our core and propel ourselves through space. So at its essence, movement is energy transferring through different parts of the body. And optimal posture is going to maximize our ability to efficiently transfer energy throughout our body. By removing kind of any extra blocks, the energy has to move through, and setting our muscles into a place where they're ready to receive energy from other parts of the body and just move forward from there, rather than starting from a place where maybe we're out of alignment, first having to get into alignment and then being able to move. So this is why posture as a foundational concept is really key. So let's run through some tools and concepts we'll talk about from here. And some of this will get nitty gritty. So like I said, really feel free to interrupt me. Any questions so far? I'll just pause for a couple seconds and you can unmute if you have any. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So first thing we'll talk about is the PLUMB line, which is an imaginary line we use to assess our posture. It's a helpful starting point. So we know where we're starting and we know maybe what we need to work on. Second thing we'll talk about are the curves of the spine and how our natural curves in the spine are really key to keeping ourselves healthy and absorbing shock in the body. And then finally, we'll talk about the pelvis and how important the pelvis is for both of these concepts, and how it really influences the way energy moves throughout our body. Energy meaning force, movement of the muscles, any of that. So first off, we've got the PLUMB line, and this was our first graphic on the initial slide. The PLUMB line is a way to mark our optimal posture. So ideally, in someone who is aligned, the PLUMB line runs through the middle of the ear, the middle of the shoulder joint, middle of our hip joint, so kind of bisecting the pelvis, the middle of the knee joint, and then it would stack over the ankle joint. So we can use this idea of just aligning these key parts of the body to help us see where things are moving away from our ideal positioning. I think I'll just show you an example. So this is me. On the left here, we've got day one of my yoga teacher training back a year ago in August. And we have day two, the end of the training, 3 weeks later, 3 weeks apart, 21 days, 22-ish. I would love if someone could unmute and just tell me what you see between these two photos. What do you see on the left that is different on the right?
One thing I noticed is that on the left, you can see that like your neck and like your head is more forward past the line, while on the one on the right, you're more like symmetrical a little bit.
Yeah, that's perfect. Excellent answer. Also, thanks. You're like sticking your neck out there, unmuting yourself. Big props. So yeah, exactly. And this is, I have to say, like, this moment where I saw my week 3 picture was very emotional for me. And we'll talk a little bit more about how I was feeling during this first picture a little bit later in the conversation, but that is exactly right. We see my head is falling forward, and it kind of is influencing my shoulder joint as well. It's just generally, it feels like the energy is like sagging forward and down, almost like I was leaning and gonna fall forward. So this is kind of our first pit stop. Huge tool for you to analyze your posture multiple times, as many times as you want, is to draw the plumb line on a photo. So the steps for this are exactly what I've done. You'll set your feet up under the hips here, turn yourself sideways so the camera is getting a side shot, take a photo of the way you would normally stand. And then you can use a program like Paint or Canva, really any fairly basic photo software, and go ahead and draw a line. The trickiest thing with finding your plumb line is that our anchor point might be slightly different depending on what areas we need to work on. So some people are really tilted in the pelvis, and it might be easier to align the line with the ear and the shoulder. But the general idea, I would say, is start with this, finding the middle of the hip joint and the pelvis right here, and see what's happening above and below that point. So this is our tool number 1. Check in that you can do as many times as you want, and kind of edit and move around over time. And you will be amazed if you are consistently and intentionally thinking about how you're standing. You will see a difference and you will see things change. And we'll talk more about tools to kind of head on that path. Does anybody have questions now? Any plumb line questions? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Again, you can always unmute and interrupt if something comes up. So next, kind of diving deeper and getting into a more visceral part of the body, we're going to talk about the spine. And the spine has natural curves to it, and it's considered an S-shaped curve. So we see on this far left drawing, at the top of our head, we've got what they call a lordotic curve, which is a little bit of a curve towards the jawline in the neck. We move down to our mid-back and we have the opposite. It's called the kyphotic curve in the rib cage, middle back, thoracic region. And then at the bottom of the spine, we have, again, a lordotic curve in our low back. So we call this lumbar spine area and this cervical spine, we say that they have sympathetic curves. And then finally, at the very base, as the spine connects to the pelvis, we have another small kyphotic curve. So technically, this is sympathetic with the thoracic spine. We don't talk often, people don't talk about this part of the spine as much. So it's a little less common. But So these curves are here and they're supposed to be here. Our skeletal structure is designed to have this S-shaped curvature. And its function is to support our upright posture while also helping with shock absorption. So while it may not seem like a lot of force, since we are upright animals, as we walk through the world, we run, we jump, all of that force from the ground is pushing up through our body. And if we had just a stick straight spine that didn't have some motion to it in structure, we would probably get a lot of jamming and upsetting of our vertebrae, of those small bones that make up the spine. So we have these wonderful natural curves that kind of function to beautifully do our biomechanic or serve our needs biomechanically. And I think the reason I wanted to talk about this is sometimes when we think about having good posture, we create this idea that it's eliminating all curves in the spine. And that's actually not the case. You don't want to completely flatten these curves in the spine. That actually will induce a lot of pain, and it will minimize your ability to absorb shock. So as we are finding optimal posture, we want to retain these S-shaped curves in the spine without moving towards something like kyphosis, which would be kyphosis would be like over curving in the upper back, or lordosis, which would be really swaying in the low back. So we want to find our healthy middle ground with our spinal curvature. And again, we're going to have some more practical tools in just a bit to kind of understand what that is. Final piece here, and maybe the biggest piece, if you've ever taken a class with me, I never shut up about it, the pelvis. So we spoke about the plumb line and we spoke about spinal curves, and the pelvis is massively influential in both of those things. It's really a driver for how the rest of our body stacks. And from these photos here, I'm not going to dive into all the muscles that connect to the pelvis, but what I want you to take away, we've got here a view from the front. Up on the top, we have a side view, and on the back, we've got, or on the bottom, we have this back view. So the takeaway here is so many muscles connect to the pelvis in so many different places. And that is really why we place the pelvis as this key part of finding optimal posture. All of these muscles, as they contract and as we use them throughout the day, are pulling. Like, the pelvis is the anchor point, and then the muscle is pulling to move some other part of the body. So because we have all of these forces pulling up, down, out, diagonally, sideways throughout the day, if we don't have a solid sense of where our neutral is, we can very quickly start to introduce discomfort, especially in the low back, in the front of the hips. And we also start to lose our efficiency in that energy transference, like I was talking about at the start of our talk. Pelvis is the key area where our lower body is connecting to our upper body. So if something is off there, if things are tilted and not able to function as efficiently as they could, we also often are losing energy as it moves, or force, whatever you want to think about it, or however you want to think about it. We are losing energy efficiency as that force moves through the body. And this might sound a little pie in the sky right now, but we really are going to do some exercises in just probably 5 minutes to kind of ground the information. So big takeaway here, tons of muscles connect to the pelvis, and that kind of makes it the nexus of getting our optimal posture. This is the starting place for all of us. And the common issue or challenge that a lot of people have is pelvic tilt. Another thing I talk about a lot. So because of the way we live our lives in the modern world, especially during COVID and while everything is virtual, we are sitting all the time. We're often hunched over laptops when we wish we had, 3 big screens so that we could sit up straight and see everything. It's a really hard time to feel like our lives are not impeding us from finding this optimal posture. And I just want to say, like, give yourself grace, because it's really hard when it feels like the structure of your life isn't setting you up to feel good in your body. So we really want to be empowered with some tools to alleviate some of the challenges. So modern life is making it really hard to find a neutral position. And we see on the left here, this is a cartoon representation of what neutral pelvis looks like. So if you can imagine the shape of the pelvis, I think this picture does a great job. It's this hollow cavern. And a neutral pelvis will, imagine you filled that cavern with juice or wine or soup, depending on where you're at in the week. And a neutral pelvis, you will contain all of that liquid in this, what they call the pelvic bowl. When we start to get into tilts, as we were talking on the next page, it's like you're spilling whatever liquid was in that pelvis is going to start spilling in one direction or the other. So a helpful image is imagining you had some liquid in your pelvis and you want to keep it contained rather than spilling out. The most common, I think, the thing I want to emphasize more today is anterior pelvic tilt, which is when that liquid or that soup, whatever you imagine is in your pelvic bowl, is spilling forward towards like your toes. So as we see here, the diagonal of this skeleton's pelvic tilt, if we had juice in there or something, it would be spilling towards the toes. When we're in this position, we often feel really aggravated in the front of the hips. You'll feel like you need to stretch the front of the hips. The hip flexors are tight, feeling tense, not very supple. At the same time, our core is really not placed in a position to be well engaged. So when we, if the ribs are here and the pelvis is here, and then we start to tip the pelvis, we've essentially lengthened the muscles that are connecting between the ribs and the pelvis. And then it makes it much harder for those muscles to contract, which is what we want them to do when we activate them. So if our skeleton is out of alignment, getting back to why this posture matters, it often will bias our muscles into a position that disables them from efficiently showing up, working, and firing. On the back side of things, people often feel like they have very tight hamstrings when they're struggling with anterior tilt, and it's actually a symptom of having lengthened, not stretched necessarily, but overextended hamstrings that can't contract efficiently, just like we were talking about with the core. So it's like the hamstrings want to show up and do their job, this back of the leg section, but when they're pulled too far, they can't efficiently work for you, and then they start to feel like they're tight, but they're actually often just not able to work for you. And then maybe the hallmark of the anterior tilt is tight, low back. Feels like jacked up is the only word I can think of to describe it. Things feel tight back there. If you often feel like you need to do a lot of seated forward folds, there is potential that something's going on with an anterior pelvic tilt. And we're going to talk about how to find neutral throughout the day. The other side of this is the reverse. It's called posterior pelvic tilt, and it's way less common. I'm not going to touch on it as much, but essentially this diagonal we see dipping towards the toes would be reversed, so that liquid in our pelvic bowl would start falling towards our heels. You actually start to curve the pubic bone like it was moving forward and almost up towards your chin or something. It's a very extreme image, but it's the idea. So how am I supposed to know all this and integrate all of this physically? We're going to go through 3 quick exercises. You don't have to do them with me. I will demo them, but if you want to do them with me, that's great too. So first, we will find triple S in a supine position, which would be on our backs, and I'll tell you what triple S is. Second, we will practice a low bridge, which is key exercise for finding that neutral pelvis. And then third, we'll kind of integrate this in a more bipedal standing position by finding our triple S at the wall. So before we get into this demo moment, I just am going to touch on what the triple S is. We use triple S in LIT as a very quick and easy way to check in with optimal posture. essentially it's like a proxy for a plumb line test, but in the real world. So obviously in the real world, I'm not walking around with like a line I can attach to myself and check in. So the triple S is our stand-in for our plumb line, and it's actually a pretty good one. The three S's we're talking about in the triple S are the sacrum, which is the very back of the pelvis. So I can't see any of you, but I'm going to trust you do this. As you're sitting wherever you are, take your hands to the rim of your pelvis. So like your hands are up on your hips, and you'll feel the bones there. And then trace those bones back behind you. Bring your thumbs down about an inch and then in towards the middle. And you'll feel this kind of broad, stable feeling bone. I'm going to stand up and show you so that this is less abstract. But so I put my hands on the rims of my pelvis. I walk my thumbs in towards the back. I feel the back of my pelvis. Then I walk my fingers down about an inch and then in towards center. And this is where my sacrum is. So it's right, very, very low back. The crude way to tell someone to find it is it's usually an inch or two above your butt crack. I don't like saying that as much in a presentation, but here we are. So that's S number one. S number two is more commonly known. It's the scapula, but we know it often as the shoulder blade. So it's this big wingy bone here. Let me see if I can pop it out. Yep. So scapula. And you can just take one hand to one side and start moving some shoulder rolls in one shoulder, and you'll feel that broad wing-like bone moving on your ribs. And then the final piece of this is the skull. And it's a very specific part of the skull. They're called the suboccipital condyles. So this whole thing is the skull, but we really want to zero in on the place where the skull meets the top of the neck. So the base of the skull comes to meet the top of the neck, and you'll feel these two bumps on either side of the neck and the spine. And that's ideally where we're going to focus our energy in the triple S. So we have these three S's. What does that have to do with posture? Well, when we're moving, we can think about aligning sacrum, scapula, and skull. And that's a quick way to sense if we are stacking our bones properly so that we can then move efficiently. So I'm gonna demo these three exercises. Number one, we'll find triple S on the floor. I'm gonna head to my mat and just talk you through. So step one, I'll put my feet on the floor and they'll be hip distance apart. Knees are gonna be up to the ceiling, and then just lay yourself back. And you're not trying to squeeze the feet in too far. But as you lay here, you can play with tipping the pelvis, so like curving the tailbone into the mat, and then doing a reverse, curling it up towards the ceiling. And we're playing here with anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. So when you tip that tailbone down, you'll feel the aggravation in the front of the hips. Those hip flexors really light up. And that's often why we're tight there. And then when you round in the opposite direction for posterior tilt, you'll feel more lengthening in the front, but kind of an over-recruitment in the back of the body. So we want to find the sweet spot between that. And that means feeling for that sacrum bone, getting a sense of where that is, and letting it really anchor into the floor. Next step here, we'll draw the scapula onto our rib cage and feel them really pressing into the floor. If you don't feel anything, you can bring the elbows to the floor, bring the hands up to the ceiling so you make 90-degree angles, and kind of press back on the hands and draw the shoulder blades onto the back. And that might give you a bit more sensation there. So we've got S1, sacrum, S2, scapula. Final, number 3, is the back of the skull. We can pull the chin slightly towards the throat and try to get that very base of the skull lengthened towards the floor. The final step here that I'll add, because it's something I struggle with, is trying to pull the front of the ribs into the back body. So it's easy to flare and over the arch in the back to make all of this happen. But we really want to try to keep those ribs contained and make, because we want to stretch the areas that are tight rather than compensate by opening the rib. So this is our basic understanding of triple S. And we'll keep the feet where they are, heading to make sure we understand neutral pelvis. Press the feet into the floor, slightly lengthen the tailbone towards the heels, and then squeeze the glutes and lift up into a low bridge. And we're just coming about 4 or 6 inches off the mat here. And we're continuing to try to keep the orientation of the sacrum and the scapula and the skull, even though we've lifted the pelvis. So we don't want to tip the tailbone down towards the floor. That hurts the back a lot. We don't want to overly curve the pubic bone up towards the seat. We want to find this nice neutral middle, and we're using the glutes to find that place. So this is a really helpful tool if pelvic tilt is something that you're struggling with. It's such a helpful way to fire the glutes and make sure they're awake and on. So you can lower to the floor, maybe give the knees a wiggle, and then we'll come into our third iteration of an exercise, which is finding that same triple S alignment just at the wall. I'm going to turn my computer to show you the wall. Not the best angle, but here we are. And when we come to the wall, be gentle with yourself. You'll start to walk the feet probably 6 inches, maybe more, away from the wall. So at first we're not touching at all. And then bring a gentle bend to the knees. And starting with the sacrum first, we'll just sit back into the wall and feel that broad bone really pressing into the wall. And we're going to go through the same process. Number 2, we start to lean back with the upper body and pull those scapula so that they lay flat on the wall. Take a moment and check in with the ribs here. They might want to flare to make the scapula hit the wall. Really try to pull them down. It takes more core strength than you would think. So we have 2. And then our third S, back of the skull. We lengthen the back of the neck, pull that chin towards the throat, and try to draw the base of the skull onto the floor. Now, as you get more comfortable with this, you can start to straighten the legs more and see if you can find this alignment. And you can eventually start to walk the feet closer to the wall and keep practicing that triple S alignment. That is an exercise that you can do throughout the day. You can check in with it before you do any movement practice as a quick way to see what's going on with your posture. If you find a certain area is really hard to get towards the wall, just use that as information of, maybe you need more core strength to pull the ribs back to the wall, or maybe you need more length in the back body to give some space for the ribs to move back in space. So let this be an iterative process that changes over time rather than something that you need to perfectly execute immediately. Use it as a check-in, use it as a tool similar to the plumb line, and then use that low bridge exercise to remind you what your neutral pelvis feels like and to get the glutes awake to help you. So phase 2 now. We've done some exercises. Oops. And now we're going to head into this next layer, which is fascia. Fascia is a connective tissue, and it's kind of the body's like in-between stuff. It's not a ligament, it's not a tendon, it's not cartilage. It's this web-like network that contains all of our muscles. And often when we're talking about movement, we only talk about the muscles and recruiting certain muscles. And for example, like I'm often saying, turn your glutes on to open up the front of the hip. But the reality is that muscles aren't really moving in isolation. They're moving within this connected network of fascia. So fascia is one of these tissues that's everywhere, and it's really going to influence posture, alignment, and movement. So we'll just talk a little bit more about that here. So on this guy, these weird skeletal muscular cartoons on the right, we see these big swaths of white tissue, and that generally is showing different spaces of fascia. So you can see there's fascia going all the way up the spine. We've got a big back chain of fascia that actually will connect all the way down to the Achilles tendon. Essentially, this is the key, like nothing moves in isolation, and fascia is a huge part of that. So we have to look at how we're holding our structure as a whole, and how our overall like suppleness of that connective tissue is working, in addition to just thinking about the bones and the muscles. Something that can be both liberating and tricky about fascia is that standing with suboptimal posture or moving in suboptimal posture can lead to fascia restriction. So when we repeatedly maybe scrunch in our low back, this big swath of fascia in the back is going to get more, it will feel more brittle. And then when that fascia is restricted, it will feel a little bit harder to open up that space. But I think the saving grace of fascia and the beauty of it is that the way we start to get that tissue to be more supple and to open up more is through movement. Essentially, it takes on water as we move it. So when things feel brittle, if you start to move more, get the juices flowing, if you will, it really will start to open up and become more flexible, and it will increase your range of motion. So it's like the challenge of it is that if we're not careful when we move, in ways where we're compensating for tight areas, and we reinforce that over and over again, our fascia is going to feel really stuck. But the beauty of that is that by changing the way we're moving and by moving with intention, we can open that up fairly easily. So fascia is an important part of the conversation that I think is often left out because we get so interested in talking about singular muscles, but really just remember that we are all one kind of big connected web of movement. So to review some of what we've talked about, and we're going to talk some more about all of this in movement now. Posture is the key to safe, sustainable, injury-free movement and efficient movement. When we find our optimal skeletal alignment, we are finding a way to use more efficiency in our energy transfer, and we also will start to build strength much faster. So when we set our skeleton up to be where it wants to be, our muscles are going to be set up to be where they want to be as well. And then this final thing we just touched on, that as we move, we are hydrating that fascia, the connective tissues, and that's going to help you in those restricted areas. So really, movement is a key to improving all of this, not just thinking about it, but continuing to hydrate our bodies through movement. So kind of coming back to this question, like, why do we care so much about posture and movement? When we repeatedly deviate from our optimal positioning, we are opening the door for injury, for pain, for strange compensation that eventually will likely lead to injury. And when we repeatedly go down that path, we over time just weaken and weaken and weaken our ability to avoid injury. And not to be a bummer about it, but there's always a breaking point. So sometimes, like, for example, to ground this in a real world example, I tore my Achilles tendon, and I had been feeling calf tightness for months before that, and just kind of was like, it'll get better, it'll get better, it'll get better. And there was a breaking point. There was a point when it couldn't take any more wear and tear. So we have to think about kind of the amazing power that we have in using our posture and our movement to keep us moving in the ways we want to move to avoid injury every day. So heading back to this was the plumb line photo we talked about at the beginning. And I drew this using like clip art lines and stuff. So I'm going to explain what I'm trying to show here. Essentially, we saw like pretty much my lower body's okay, but we saw this big lean forward with the head and the shoulders. At this time in my life, I've had so much upper back pain. Like this area around my shoulder blades was always feeling uncomfortable. My mid back region was really just felt tight and like I always had to stretch it out. But no matter how much stretching I did, it never felt better. And that is because essentially it's like creating an anchor point at my upper back and then taking a weight, tying it to the anchor point and throwing the weight over my head. So I have this huge load pulling down towards the floor in front of me and creating a lot of tension in this area here. And this dotted line drawing down to my sacrum is just to signify that over time, as this tension gets worse and worse and worse, it will start to pull further down the chain. So none of these things happen in isolation. And I'm really motivated by this idea that like none of us should be living in pain. We have the tools, we have the power to avoid being in pain. And when we start to load in these positions, like when our body, certain areas of our body is loaded because we're compensating or falling forward somewhere, then when you put that in movement, it's like multiplying the weight or the load put on that area by 100. So if I went to do a deadlift in this position, it's like multiplying the danger of this big weight pulling on my upper back by, I mean, there's not a real number for it, but maybe, 110 times worse, who knows? So that's why we care so much about finding this good posture. Next piece of this, and this is one of my favorite principles of the body, based on the structural mechanics of our skeleton, different parts of our body want to be stable and different parts of our body want to be mobile or kinetic. And when I say want, I mean they're built, their function, when you look at the bone, is either stability or mobility. And when you look at how the joints come together. So if you look down this chain, it's really an alternating structure here. Our neck, very precious, holding the head up, wants to be stable. And then right below it, an area we often don't think of as mobile, our thoracic spine rib cage region is designed to be mobile. It's an area we can twist and we can also extend through the thoracic spine. Conversely, an area, especially in yoga, we often talk about as having a lot of mobility is actually designed for stability. The lumbar spine is not very structurally robust, and because of that, we have to use our muscles to keep it stable instead of lean into the bony structure and just move it all around. Alternating again down the chain, we see the hip, ball and socket joint, super mobile, all ranges of motion there, and the hip really wants to move to feel good. And then these last two, the knee wants to be stable. It's kind of, as many people have knee pain, you probably know, it's a bit of a precious joint. And then finally, our ankle is also very mobile. So thinking about this alternating stability, mobility structure of the skeleton when you're moving can kind of open the door and be a key to understanding if you start to move the lumbar spine a lot, that probably means you're locking off the surrounding areas. So when we start to switch what these different areas want to be doing, it's a sign to us that we're compensating in some way. So maybe we're really restricted in the thoracic spine, and instead of being mobile in the thoracic spine, we compensate by moving the lumbar spine because it's easier. So when we combine this concept with our optimal posture, we are on the road to sustainability, to keeping our joints healthy, and to maximizing our range of motion and muscle development. So now we're going to do a little application exercise, and then I'll open it up to questions for you guys. So I would love if you guys would unmute and chime in, but also no pressure if that feels like too much. So just for reference on the left here, I brought our plumb line man back. And think about that triple S exercise I showed you, where we want to align the back of the skull, the scapula, and the sacrum. And then no shade to any of these people. I don't want this to be a shaming moment, but let's just kind of curiously discuss what we see and what maybe would be a safer position for these people to be squatting in. So if anybody wants to unmute and chime in, let me know, or just go for it. Let's start with the guy in the middle.
I don't know if
Alexandra, do you have?
Yeah, I don't know.
Go for it. No, this is a safe space.
I would say that
space.
He's leaning too far forward, like his lower regions, like it's like on a diagonal kind of thing.
Yeah, I think if we look here, it's subtle, but I think what you said is right. He has a little bit of pelvic tilt here. Also, major kudos for going out there and saying it, Alexandra. Hats off to you. He's got a little bit of a tilt in his pelvis here, and you can see a slight arch in the back that is kind of pitching him forward a bit. And then there's one other big thing I see with him, more in the shoulder neck region. Can anybody tell me what they see there? Okay, I'll say it.
Should his head be faced more down?
Yes, exactly. You guys are experts. No need to hesitate. Yeah. So when we think about, okay, so here's his scapula, here's his sacrum. I already said, he's got a little bit of tilt there. His sacrum is here. In general, that's not terrible. But then we get to the back of the skull, and what we would think if we had alignment there is that the back of the skull would be more where his ear is. And instead, he's pulled his gaze forward, and we see the neck is all aggravated in the back. And because this is like a real throwback, or callback, because this cervical spine, the neck curve and the low back curve are called sympathetic, I would suspect that because he is looking forward and exaggerating that curve in his neck, that is why he's got this little bit of a sway back in his squat here. So you guys, you're aces. You're like the Sherlock Holmeses of posture and alignment. Exactly. So we want to think critically about how we're seeing people move. And then just quickly, if anybody wants to shout out what they think they see here, no wrong or right answer, and we can discuss after. I guess you could talk about the standing position and then the squat position, or one. You can pick.
Well, for standing, she's leaning very far back.
Exactly.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was going to say the same thing. Like, it seems like in the standing one, her back is just too far back and her body's too forward.
Yes. All stars. So her standing position, and to me, the standing position is the way more obvious one, but she's in a classic sway back position where she's really like leaning her pelvis forward and tilting. And then she's got this extreme curve in the low back. So like the back of her skull and her scapula are fairly aligned, but then there's just crazy added curve in her spine there. I would bet you $10 she has a lot of low back pain. In the squat, I'll just quickly say she has a similar thing as our gentleman in the middle here, where she's looking forward and that's pulled her skull out of regular alignment. And you can also just kind of tell she's not, there's a little bit of tilt in the pelvis, just like we saw in her standing position. So where we stand shows up in how we move. And it looks like she's just kind of sagging in the squat. And that's often a sign that there could be more core integration. So you guys are all stars. Excellent job. And we've just got one more slide to kind of look through. So thinking about triple S, and we're not going to go through each picture here, but I'm from the yoga world. And what I often notice in a lot of the yoga photos we put up for people to look at, triple S is nowhere to be found, and they've there's often a complete abandonment of that kinetic chain we were talking about, where it's mobile, stable. So for example, I mean, really intense back bends can be done safely, but often we're taught to just kind of throw ourselves into these contorted positions that don't actually serve the function of our skeleton. I'm not going to dive too deep on this. I just wanted to say, like, when you start to think about photos like this in the context of that skull scapula sacrum concept, even when they're hinging at the hips, like here, we just want to imagine that from there was the same line continued, rather than seeing some of these curves. And often, not just in yoga, but in a lot of movement modalities, we are not encouraged to think critically about if we're doing that throughout our movement. Again, gateway to injury, and we should be wanting to move for the rest of our lives. So I just want to review those exercises we went through today, and then I'll open it up for questions, or if you guys have specific stuff you're struggling with, you can feel free to say that. So number one, we can use this triple S skull scapula sacrum as a regular check-in to see what our posture is doing throughout the day. Number two, we can use the low bridge to activate our glutes and kind of zap our pelvis into a neutral position. The more we practice that reclined low bridge, the more likely you'll be able to integrate that when you're practicing the triple S. So it'll be easier to find the neutral pelvis in the triple S. We didn't do this specifically, but as you're trying this stuff, use your hands to check in on what's happening. Often in my classes, I have people sandwiching the pelvis, or having your hands on either side of the pelvis and sensing, like, if you are you tipping your bowl, or is it neutral? So your hands can become a really helpful check-in tool so that you can feel what your body's doing in space. Fourth, we did touch on, but not explicitly, use video and photo. Like, you guys already have shown in this like 50 minutes how much you intuit and see in people's positioning. So use that power and that strength in your own movement by taking photos of things you often do or things that don't feel very good, and see if you can identify where the break in the expected chain is. Trust your instincts. You guys don't need to hesitate. And then the final thing, I think, in this COVID world is really important. Think about your work or your study space, and if it is setting you up to have this stacked posture. So a huge cheat for me has been stacking my laptop on top of either yoga blocks or some books, so that I can lift the screen to eye height and I don't have to be curving forward as much. Other things you can look at are, if you have a separate keyboard, where it's placed to kind of help you draw the shoulders on the back, and even getting a separate mouse helps with that as well. So just starting to critically think about the spaces you're existing in, and if they're supporting you on this journey to find these types of alignment. So we want to set up our space to make that easier. Finally, this is all my contact info. You can contact me about anything. I often have people send me photos of stuff, and I'll tell them what I see, give some suggestions. I've got my class dates on here. And with that, I'll just open it up to questions. I know we're a little bit close to time, but I'm happy to stick around if you have more questions that go over 7. So thanks so much for your attention and your participation. Throw them at me.
I had one question. So I know you kind of touched on like in your workspace, like stacking your computer with like books and stuff like that. But I've also heard, like, is it actually beneficial to like stand and do your work, or like have your stuff propped up, like your desk a little propped up higher or something like that? I know I've seen like people do that. I was just like kind of wondering how that could help for your workspace.
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. And the standing desk phenomenon like really took off, I don't know, I think 10 years ago. It started getting super popular. The tricky thing with standing desks are being static and stationary in any one position is never ideal. So even if you're standing, if you're doing it for 8 hours on end and not moving other than your position in your workspace, if you're not moving otherwise, it's still not great for the body. So I think the ideal with your workspace is having a little bit of adaptability. So I like to kind of sit for a little while and then I'll move to stand for a little while. I'll get up and kind of move my joints around, just do some small stuff when I have 5 minutes in between something. So standing is good when it's part of a more kind of diverse movement throughout the workday, if that makes sense. Being static in either sitting or standing is really not ideal, but also do your best. Like, these are strange times and we're not in perfect workspaces. So that's my general take on it. Is that helpful?
That was really helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Glad to help. Any other questions?
Hey Meredith, it's Ryan. I am wondering if what your opinion is on foam rolling. I mean, in running, I mean, in a lot of instances, it's just, orthodoxy. You get done with a workout, do some stretching, whether it's active or static, and then do some foam rolling. So is there, I don't know, anything you can shed light on regarding it?
Well, Ryan, I have big opinions on foam rolling, actually. I think foam rolling is great, and I also think it has been miscommunicated. So foam rolling, for those of you who don't know, you can buy these cylinders that are these foamy textures, and then people have all these different tutorial videos on how to roll out different parts of the body as like a self-massage tool. So I think it's great, and generally what is actually happening when you're foam rolling is you're hydrating the fascia. So it's like you've got brittle fascia and the foam roller just slightly starts to move it, and then it hydrates more and it's going to be more supple and help you move better. The problem is that we started abiding by this idea that like harder and firmer is better. And when it comes to fascia and that more kind of soft tissue massage area, it's exactly the opposite. So a lot of those foam rollers like will have the spikes on them and they'll be like hard plastic or something. And as people do it, it kind of feels like it hurts so good. Like, I think I'm helping myself. But usually what happens in reaction to the intensity of the firmness of that cylinder is that like the muscles and the fascia just kind of shrink up, almost like a cat in water. And that's the opposite of what you're trying to do. So I love foam rolling. I think it's fantastic, but I only think it's fantastic when I use super soft materials. My favorite, there's this entire world of foam rolling modality. It's called Melt, and they sell their own foam rollers that are super squishy and soft and just, it's the most amazing feeling. And you leave feeling like a completely new person. Like, they have entire class, like 40-minute classes you can do. And it just feels like you have a new body, almost like somebody gave you a manual massage. And it's just that we need, when it comes to the soft tissue, more of a gentle touch than that firm, harder's better, I'm going to lift 800 pounds kind of mentality. So, the TLDR of that is foam rolling's great. Just don't be going too firm and trying to like knead out the knots, because it reacts in exactly the opposite way in most cases.
That was really interesting because the foam roller I have is just a pretty cheap one off of Amazon, and I think it's about as firm as styrofoam can get. So I will be getting a new foam roller. Thank you.
Yeah, and it, you can sense it. Like, when you get on those really firm ones, you can feel yourself almost like the muscles tensing to lift you off of the pressure. Also, if like, feel free to hop off whenever people need to go, but you can feel your body reacting in that kind of like, oh, this is too much way. So that I think the foam rolling world is much more of a gentle approach than it's often sold to us. But people look up Melt if you're interested. They sell a bunch of them.
I'm certainly never relaxed when I'm foam rolling, so apparently that's not how it's supposed to be.
Exactly. Any other questions? All right, well, I'm gonna stick around for a few minutes. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I'll stick around if any have questions. I'm here for you. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. And I didn't see any of these chats, but I appreciate you all. I hope you're doing well. Take my contact info and, feel free to reach out if anything comes up.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Nice to meet you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Alexandra.